A woman wrapped in Hollywood diamonds, yet bound by invisible, suffocating chains. Liz Renay walked into Los Angeles expecting studio contracts and standing ovations, only to be processed as a federal inmate scrubbing concrete floors. How did a face destined for movie screens become the ultimate sacrificial lamb for Los Angeles' most paranoid mob boss? When Mickey Cohen lured Liz Renay into his terrifying underworld, he didn't want a romantic partner. He needed a disposable decoy. As the FBI's net tightened, the ruthless kingpin vanished into the shadows, leaving the ambitious starlet to be devoured by the federal justice system. Was her spectacular downfall the brutal price of blind ambition, or the tragic result of a master manipulator's coercive control? Yet the making of the syndicate's most tragic pawn did not happen overnight. The seeds of her destruction were sown far from the California spotlight. Born in the impoverished American Midwest on April 14, 1926, Pearl Elizabeth Dobbins viewed her Marilyn Monroe-like beauty not as a blessing, but as a weapon to escape obscurity. Reinventing herself as the sophisticated Liz Renay, she packed a suitcase for California, expecting open doors and studio contracts. Instead, she walked straight into a predator's hunting ground. In 1950s Los Angeles, the glittering illusions of Hollywood masked the dark reality of the Mafia, where mobsters often collected ambitious young actresses as disposable trophies. One of the most notorious figures in this brutal ecosystem was Mickey Cohen, a former featherweight boxer prone to explosive violence. Cohen took over the LA rackets after the murder of his mentor, Bugsy Siegel. Paranoid and obsessively controlling, he did not court women. He acquired them. When Cohen laid eyes on Liz, he didn't see a struggling artist looking for a break. He saw a premium asset, a glamorous decoy that he immediately pulled into his orbit with the overwhelming force of a hostile takeover. Mickey pulled her into his orbit with terrifying speed. Instead of asking her on traditional dates, he simply summoned her, sending town cars to whisk her away. Within days, she was draped in expensive jewelry and designer clothes, installed in a luxury apartment with the rent paid entirely in cash. To seal the trap, he dangled the ultimate bait, promises to call in favors with studio heads to launch her acting career. To an outsider, it looked like a fairy tale. A powerful, wealthy man lifting a struggling artist out of obscurity. Falling for the illusion, Liz believed she had bypassed the grueling audition process to find a shortcut to the top. Equating his aggressive spending with affection, she remained completely blind to the mechanics of coercive control. These were not gifts. They were a method of branding. Mickey used his immense wealth to systematically isolate Liz from the real world. Every diamond necklace he clasped around her neck was a tightening collar. Cutting her off from independent financial survival, he ensured she couldn't last a single week without his money. He created an artificial reality, controlling the roof over her head, the clothes on her back, and the false hope of a major film role. He gladly paid for acting classes, yet never pulled the strings to actually secure a studio contract. Mickey demanded complete dependency, viewing an independent woman as a flight risk and a reliant one as a captive employee. The psychological conditioning was subtle but absolute. Auditions dried up because Mickey refused to surrender her to a 12-hour movie set where other men could look at her and where he couldn't control the schedule. Instead, he required her available at his whim, a polished trophy on his arm to incite envy among rival mobsters. You don't let a trophy build a career, you lock it away. Her early Hollywood friends were slowly pushed away as Mickey made his disdain obvious, dismissing them as bad influences and users. He systematically replaced her social circle with his own associates. She found herself spending her evenings surrounded by bookies, enforcers, and corrupt politicians. She was surrounded by people, but she was entirely alone. She had no one to confide in. She had no one to give her an objective perspective. The only voice she heard was Mickey's. Though rarely directed at her, violence lingered constantly in the periphery, aimed at rival bookmakers or men who owed Mickey money. Mickey would smile for the cameras outside a restaurant, step into an alley to order a man beaten half to death over a gambling debt, then casually return to their table to order champagne. His hands remained clean, his suit unwrinkled. Without ever raising a hand to her, he was teaching a brutal lesson, demonstrating his absolute power over life and death in the city, and showing her the terrifying consequences of crossing him. Liz learned to look the other way. She learned to accept the blood money that paid for her lifestyle. She convinced herself she was special. She told herself Mickey loved her too much to ever turn that violence toward her. It is a common survival mechanism. When you are trapped in a cage with a predator, you must convince yourself the predator is actually a protector. You must believe you are the exception to his cruelty. If you admit the truth, the terror will paralyze you. This is the core of psychological manipulation. The victim becomes the fiercest defender of the abuser. Liz Renay stopped trying to be a movie star. She started focusing entirely on surviving the role of a mobster's girlfriend. She did not know it yet, but the trap had fully closed. Psychological manipulation doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow, steady injection into the bloodstream. Mickey Cohen didn't beat Liz Renay. He didn't need to. He used isolation to bind her. He shattered her sense of reality. He employed a tactic abusers often use to keep their victims off balance. He showered her with public displays of affection, then plunged her into cold indifference once the door closed. Sitting in a booth at the Brown Derby, he would hold her hand and kiss her cheek for the flashing paparazzi cameras. But the moment they stepped into his armored Cadillac, that manufactured warmth evaporated. Staring out the window and ignoring her questions, he made her feel entirely invisible. This contrast was incredibly calculated. It made her crave his validation. It forced her to work even harder to please him. She began to self-censor her own behavior. She was careful with her words. She avoided any topic that could trigger his rage. She became a ghost haunting her own life. Then he began using her to circulate money. Cash flowed in from illegal gambling rings and extortion schemes. It was dirty paper. Mickey needed to clean it up. Handing Liz thick brown envelopes, he ordered her to deposit the cash, rent safe deposit boxes, and sign real estate documents in her name. He never explained the source of the wealth. He only gave orders, and she obediently followed. Wearing a mink coat and oversized sunglasses, she walked into banks, smiling at tellers as she pushed stacks of $100 bills across the counter. She became the face of his legitimate businesses and the signature on his forged tax returns. She was the perfect pawn, a glamorous decoy ready to take the fall. The federal government was running out of patience. Local law enforcement was completely rotten. The Los Angeles Police Department was overflowing with officers on Mickey Cohen's bribery list. The FBI was forced to intervene. They formed a task force. They knew they couldn't charge him with murder or assault. Witnesses were always disappearing. Testimonies were always changing at the last minute. The government shifted tactics. They looked at the accounting books. They decided to track the money. They employed the same strategy that had brought down Al Capone. They targeted Mickey for tax evasion. The surveillance network began to tighten. Liz was the first to notice the suspicious cars. dark sedans parked across the street opposite her apartment building. Men in cheap suits, pretending to read newspapers behind the wheel. They trailed her to the grocery store and the hair salon, sitting just tables away while she drank her coffee. The visibility was intentional. They wanted to create pressure and induce panic. And that tactic worked. The constant surveillance wore down her nerves. She lost sleep. She started drinking strong liquor to calm her anxiety. Her luxurious life suddenly turned into a prolonged siege. The gilded cage revealed its cold iron bars. Mickey reacted to the FBI with an explosive rage. His paranoia reached its peak. He suspected everyone around him was wiretapping. He searched every nook and cranny of the house for electronic bugs. He ripped telephones off the walls. He fired his most loyal bodyguards. And then he directed that dark suspicion toward Liz. His interrogation was relentless. He cornered her in the bedroom, demanding to know her every move and accusing her of federal collusion. Instead of making direct threats, he simply reminded her of the rules, describing the bloody fate of informants in graphic detail. He was methodically instilling the code of silence into her very bones. Liz lived in a state of profound cognitive dissonance. Her outside world was wrapped in silk, but her inner world was a wasteland of terror. She wore diamonds, but her hands trembled. She drove an expensive convertible, but her eyes were constantly fixed on the rearview mirror. She knew the man she shared a bed with was a cold-blooded killer. She knew he would readily sacrifice her to save himself. Yet she stayed. The psychological grip had tightened too much. He had convinced her that she was utterly useless without him. He had deeply conditioned her to believe the outside world was a pack of hungry wolves, and he was her only shield. In her mind, the abuser had successfully positioned himself as a savior. As the federal agents began to tighten the net, they didn't arrest Mickey immediately. Instead, they systematically dismantled his empire, gnawing at the prey feather by feather. They issued subpoenas to associates, raided shell businesses, and seized all accounting records until they found exactly what they were looking for: anomalies, hidden assets, and most importantly, signatures. And those signatures belonged to Pearl Elizabeth Dobbins. The name she had tried to bury was now clearly printed on federal indictments. The past she wanted to escape had caught up with her in the form of a subpoena to testify before a grand jury. One early morning, 2 uniformed agents knocked on her door. Flashing their badges, they calmly handed her a subpoena to appear before a federal grand jury for tax evasion related to Mickey Cohen. Speaking in a calculated tone, they revealed they knew she was just a cover, a pawn Mickey was using, and offered her a single way out: immunity. They insisted she could walk away clean if she just told the truth about the money, warning that this was her one and only chance. Her hands trembled as she took the paper. The agents turned and walked away without another word, leaving her to lock the door and collapse helplessly against the wall. The walls of the gilded cage were closing in. She was trapped between 2 absolute powers. On one side was the United States federal government. On the other was the Los Angeles Mafia. Both demanded her absolute obedience. Both held the power to crush her life. She picked up the phone and called Mickey. It was the worst mistake she had ever made. She should have packed her bags and fled that night. She should have driven straight to the federal building and begged for protection. But instead, she reverted to her programmed instincts. She sought guidance from the very man who had orchestrated her destruction. She told him about the subpoena. She told him about the plea for immunity. Offering neither comfort nor the promise of legal defense, Mickey's voice was icy. Dropping to a chilling whisper, He ordered her to his house immediately and forbade her from speaking to anyone else. It was an absolute command, and she obeyed. She drove to his fortress in Brentwood. The iron gate slammed shut behind her. She willingly entered the lion's den. She prepared to receive final instructions on how to take the blame for a mob boss. Inside the Brentwood house, it was dark and stifling. Thick curtains blocked out the harsh California sun. The air reeked of old cigars and the smell of fear. Mickey sat behind a large mahogany desk. He looked small, but utterly dangerous. He didn't offer her water. He didn't ask how she was feeling. He reached out and demanded to see the paper. She handed him the federal court order. He read it in silence. His jaw tightened. The muscles in his neck twitched. He set the paper down on the desk. He looked up at her. His eyes were completely empty, devoid of any humanity. It was the gaze of a predator assessing a wounded animal. Then he began to speak. He didn't use threats of violence. He used the language of gratitude. He listed every item he had bought for her. He listed the rent. He listed the jewelry. He listed the clothes. He framed her entire existence as a massive debt she had to bear. He declared it was time for her to pay the bill. Instructing her on exactly how to testify, he ordered her to deny any knowledge of his business dealings. She was to claim all the cash was hers, ostensibly earned through acting and modeling. It was a blatant lie. Federal forces knew it was a lie. Mickey knew it was a lie. He didn't care if the story was believable or not. He only cared that she stick to the script. He was creating an insulating layer for himself. He was building a wall of perjury, and he placed her right in the middle of that wall. "You understand the play, Liz," Mickey said. His voice was flat. It was not a question. She nodded. A verbal agreement was too difficult to produce. The nod sealed her fate. She stood up. Her legs felt hollow. She walked out of the dark office through the heavy oak doors and back into the blinding California sunlight. The drive from Brentwood to her apartment was a blur. She gripped the steering wheel of the convertible he had bought her. The leather felt like sandpaper. The engine roared, but she felt entirely paralyzed. She was driving a vehicle she did not own, back to an apartment she did not lease, wearing clothes she did not buy. She owned nothing, not even her own truth. Parking the car and locking the door behind her, she stepped into an apartment that felt like a museum of her manipulation. Mink coats hung in the closet. Diamond necklaces sat in velvet boxes on the vanity. Approaching the mirror, she stared at the platinum blonde hair and carefully painted red lips, searching for Pearl Dobbins, the girl who had once boarded a train with a suitcase full of ambition. The days leading up to the grand jury testimony were an exercise in psychological torture. Mickey did not leave her alone to process the reality of her situation. He tightened the leash. He sent his lawyers to her apartment. They did not knock. They let themselves in. They were not there to defend her. They were there to direct her. They treated her apartment like a rehearsal stage. The lead attorney, a man with a sharp suit and dead eyes, sat on her velvet sofa, pulling stacks of bank records and property deeds from his briefcase. They all bore her signature. "We are going to go through this line by line," he stated coldly, offering neither a glass of water nor a word of comfort. "When the prosecutor asks about the deposit on October 12th, you will say it was a gift from a wealthy admirer in Texas. You do not remember his name. When he asks about the safe deposit box, you will say you kept your acting earnings there because you do not trust banks. Do you understand?" "I don't have any acting earnings," Liz said, her voice cracked. "They know I don't have any acting earnings." The lawyer slammed a hand flat on the coffee table. "They know nothing until you tell them. You are a successful model. You are a rising star. Men give you money because you are beautiful. That is the story. If you deviate from the story, you cannot be protected. Protected. The word hung in the air like a threat. They were not protecting her from the federal government. They were protecting Mickey Cohen from her, drilling her for hours. The lawyers played the role of aggressive federal prosecutors, shouting questions and backing her into logical corners. Whenever she stumbled, they berated her, systematically breaking down her natural responses to rebuild them with fabricated confidence. They were teaching her how to lie with a straight face, how to look a grand juror in the eye and commit a federal felony. She stopped eating, living entirely on black coffee and cigarettes as her stomach tied in a permanent knot of anxiety. Smoke filled the apartment, clinging to the expensive drapes and silk upholstery. As she rapidly lost weight, the tailored suits Mickey had bought her began to hang loosely on her frame, making her look like a ghost haunting a luxury showroom. Nighttime was the worst. The lawyers left, and the silence returned. She lay in the large, empty bed. She stared at the ceiling. Her mind raced through the fabricated timelines and the fake names. She tried to convince herself the lie would work. She tried to believe Mickey's promise that the feds were just fishing. But deep down, the survival instinct of Pearl Dobbins knew the truth. The federal government did not fish. They hunted, and they had already caught her. The brief, sharp urge to pack a bag and disappear into Mexico extinguished almost instantly. Mickey had already anticipated her flight, casually dropping the names of her Midwestern relatives as a thinly veiled threat. It was a clear message. Her physical escape would trigger a violent retribution against innocent people. She was anchored to Los Angeles by the weight of the Underworld's reach. The night before the testimony, the sharp ring of the telephone sliced through the silence. Staring at the receiver, she already knew who it was before slowly picking it up. "Are you ready?" Mickey's voice was a low rasp. "Yes," she lied. "Don't forget who put you in that apartment. Don't forget who buys your clothes. You walk in there tomorrow and you handle business. You owe me." The line went dead. He did not say goodbye or offer comfort. He simply issued a final command to reinforce the debt. She hung up the phone as a cold wave of resignation washed over her. The psychological grip of her abuser held firm. Many researchers note that in such dynamics, the victim often no longer sees herself as an autonomous human being. She saw herself as an extension of Mickey Cohen's will. She was a soldier going over the trench wall. Morning broke over Los Angeles. The sun was bright and indifferent. Liz walked into her bathroom. She turned on the harsh vanity lights. She began the process of assembling the armor. She applied heavy foundation to hide the dark circles under her eyes. She applied thick mascara and bright red lipstick. She was painting a mask. The federal grand jury was not going to see a terrified, manipulated victim. They were going to see Liz Renay, the untouchable Hollywood starlet. She put on a conservative navy blue suit. She wanted to look respectable, but the cut of the fabric still highlighted her figure. She was playing a dangerous game of optics. She had to look successful enough to justify the massive bank deposits, but innocent enough to deny any involvement in organized crime. She slipped on a pair of dark sunglasses. They hid the sheer panic in her eyes. A black sedan idled at the curb outside her building. One of Mickey's men was behind the wheel. The lawyer sat in the back seat. They did not speak as she got in. The atmosphere in the car was suffocating. It felt like a hearse. The drive to downtown Los Angeles highlighted the stark contrast of her reality. People walked their dogs and drank coffee in diners. living normal lives right outside the tinted windows. The car pulled up to the federal courthouse. It was a massive structure of gray stone. It looked nothing like the movie studios she had dreamed of conquering. The press was waiting. A tip had been leaked. Reporters and photographers swarmed the sidewalk. As Liz stepped out of the sedan, the flashbulbs erupted in a blinding barrage of white light. The reporters shouted her name. They shouted questions about Mickey Cohen. They shouted questions about mob money. She kept her head down. The lawyers flanked her, forming a physical barrier against the press. They pushed through the crowd. The noise was deafening. The aggressive popping of the flashbulbs felt like physical blows. She clung to her purse. Her knuckles were white. She maintained the mask. She did not cry. She did not show fear. She walked up the wide concrete steps and entered the federal building. The transition from the chaotic sunlit street to the interior of the courthouse was jarring. The air inside was cold and stale. The floors were polished marble. The walls echoed with the sound of hard-soled shoes. It was a machine built for processing guilt and dispensing punishment. The weight of the United States justice system pressed down on her shoulders. She felt incredibly small. The lawyers led her to a hard wooden bench outside the grand jury room. They instructed her to sit. They stood over her. They gave her their final tactical reminders. "Stick to the script," the lead lawyer whispered harshly. "Do not volunteer information. Answer only the question asked, yes, no, or I don't recall. If you deviate, they will trap you." She nodded. She watched men in cheap suits walk back and forth down the corridor. They carried thick manila folders. She knew what was in those folders. They held the deposit slips. They held the safe deposit box records. They held the paper trail of Mickey Cohen's illicit empire, a trail she had signed her own name to. Her mouth was completely dry. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The psychological chain around her neck was stronger than any physical lock a prison could provide. A bailiff opened the heavy oak door of the grand jury room. He stepped into the hallway. He held a clipboard. He read the name, Pearl Elizabeth Dobbins. He did not call her Liz Renay. The federal government did not care about her stage name. The federal government did not care about her Hollywood ambitions or her look-alike contests. They only cared about the legal entity that had moved the dirty money. They only cared about the signature on the bank fraud. She stood up. Her legs were trembling, but she forced them to lock. She looked at the lawyers. They did not offer a reassuring smile. They simply watched her. They were verifying that the asset was performing its function. She walked past the bailiff and stepped into the room. The grand jury room was intimidating by design. There was no judge sitting on a high bench. There was no defense attorney allowed inside with her. She was entirely alone. The room was arranged in a tiered semicircle. 23 ordinary citizens sat in those seats. They were the grand jurors. They stared down at her. To them, she wasn't a glamorous actress. She was a mob moll who chose to sleep with a ruthless killer. Looking down with hard, judgmental eyes, they saw only a crucial puzzle piece the government needed to dismantle a syndicate. In the center of the room stood the federal prosecutor, a man who built his career dismantling organized crime. The federal prosecutor cared nothing for her excuses or Cohen's psychological manipulation. Only the evidence. Standing at a podium with a stack of papers, he offered no polite greetings. He simply directed her to the witness chair, reminded her of the penalties for perjury, and laid his trap. The interrogation began. It was not a conversation. It was a surgical strike. The prosecutor's voice was sharp and relentless. He asked about her income. He asked about her acting jobs. He asked how a woman with barely any legitimate screen credits could afford a luxury apartment in a high-end neighborhood. He asked how she could afford mink coats and diamond necklaces. Taking a deep breath, she deployed the rehearsed lies. She claimed to possess savings from her early life and cited generous gifts from anonymous wealthy admirers, boldly insisting the money was entirely hers. The words tasted like ash in her mouth. The lies were thin, they were transparent. The grand jurors shifted in their seats. Some of them rolled their eyes, some of them scribbled furiously on their notepads. They knew she was lying. The prosecutor knew she was lying. The air in the room grew thick with disbelief. The prosecutor stepped out from behind the podium. He walked toward her. He held up a piece of paper. It was a bank deposit slip. Miss Dobbins, on the afternoon of the November 14th, you deposited $25,000 in cash into this account. Where did you get $25,000 in cash? She stared at the piece of paper. She saw her own signature at the bottom. The reality of the trap closed around her. She was the one who walked into the bank. She was the one who handed the cash to the teller. Mickey Cohen's name was nowhere on that document. "It was my money," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I earned it." The prosecutor did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The evidence did the shouting. He pulled out another slip, and another. He built a mountain of paper right in front of her eyes. Hundreds of thousands of dollars moving through accounts under her name. "Did Mickey Cohen give you this money to hide for him?" the prosecutor asked. The question hung in the room. It was the absolute truth. It was the exit door. She could say yes. She could point the finger. She could tear down the mob boss and walk out of the room a free woman. She thought about the dark room in Brentwood. She thought about Mickey's cold eyes. She thought about her family in the Midwest. The psychological conditioning held firm. The brainwashing was complete. The fear of the Mafia eclipsed the fear of the federal government. "No," she said. She looked the prosecutor dead in the eye and perjured herself. "Mickey Cohen has nothing to do with my finances." She committed a federal crime right there in the witness chair. She detonated her own life to preserve a criminal empire. The prosecutor stared at her for a long moment. He did not look angry. He looked at her with a profound clinical pity. He recognized exactly what she was. She was not a mastermind. She was collateral damage, and she had just absorbed a fatal blow. He gathered his papers. He thanked her for her time. He dismissed her. She stood up. Her knees nearly buckled. She walked out of the heavy oak doors. The hallway was still cold. The lawyers were waiting. They immediately flanked her. They rushed her toward the back exit to avoid the press. They pushed her into the waiting sedan. The drive back to Brentwood was silent. The adrenaline crashed out of her system, leaving behind a hollow, sickening dread. She had crossed the line. There was no going back. She had officially lied to a federal grand jury. She was a criminal. The car pulled into the gated fortress. Mickey was waiting in his office. He did not ask how she felt. He did not offer a drink to calm her nerves. He demanded a play-by-play. He asked exactly what the prosecutor asked. He asked exactly what she answered. She repeated the interaction word for word. She told him about the deposit slips. She told him how she denied his involvement. Mickey nodded. The tension in his shoulders relaxed. He seemed satisfied. He poured himself a glass of whiskey. He did not pour one for her. He told her she did a good job. He patted her on the shoulder. It was the gesture a man gives to a loyal dog that has successfully fetched a stick. "The feds have nothing," Mickey said, taking a sip of his drink. "They are just fishing. They can't prove a damn thing. You held up good, kid." He lied to her face. He knew exactly what the feds were doing. He knew they were not fishing. He knew they were building a perjury case. He knew the deposit slips were irrefutable evidence. He knew he had just secured his own temporary safety by completely sacrificing hers. He looked at the woman who had just ruined her life for him, and he felt absolutely nothing. The transaction was complete. The shield had taken the hit. The illusion of safety lasted only a few weeks. The federal machine moved slowly, but it ground everything in its path to dust. They did not need a confession from Liz Renay. They had the paper trail. They had her sworn testimony denying the paper trail. It was an open and shut case of perjury. The grand jury returned an indictment. They did not indict Mickey Cohen for tax evasion. Not yet. He was still insulated. The firewall held. They indicted Pearl Elizabeth Dobbins. 2 federal marshals arrived at her apartment early in the morning. They wore crisp uniforms. They carried handcuffs. They knocked heavily on the door. When she answered, they did not offer her a deal. They read her rights. They grabbed her wrists, spun her around, and locked the cold steel cuffs around her hands. She was placed under arrest. She asked to make a phone call. The marshals allowed it. She dialed Mickey's number. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the receiver. The phone rang. A subordinate answered. He recognized her voice. "Mickey is unavailable," the associate said flatly. "I've been arrested. The marshals are here. I need him." "He's unavailable," the voice repeated. The line went dead. The disconnect was immediate and absolute. The isolation was complete. The boss had cut the deadweight loose. She was no longer an asset. She was a liability in police custody. The mob does not rescue liabilities. They abandon them. The marshals led her out of the apartment building. There were no reporters this time. There was no glamour. She was shoved into the back of a federal transport vehicle. She looked through the wire mesh covering the window. She watched her luxury apartment building fade into the distance. She realized the terrible, crushing truth. Mickey had never loved her. The diamonds were not affection. They were a down payment on this exact moment. He had purchased her freedom in advance, and now he was collecting the goods. Transported to a holding facility, she was systematically processed, booked and fingerprinted, the harsh black ink staining her manicured nails. Directed to stand against a wall with height markers, she held a black board with white numbers across her chest as the camera coldly flashed. The glamorous photos in the Hollywood magazines were gone forever. They were replaced by a stark, high-contrast booking photo. The platinum blonde hair looked harsh under the fluorescent lights. The eyes that had charmed studio executives were wide with raw, unfiltered terror. The transformation was documented on federal film. She was no longer a starlet. She was a defendant. Mickey paid her bail. It was not an act of kindness or loyalty. It was a strategic move. He needed to keep her under his control until the trial. If she sat in a jail cell, she might get scared. She might decide to cooperate with the prosecution to reduce her sentence. He needed her out on the street where his men could watch her. He needed to ensure she stuck to the perjury. He assigned her a new defense attorney. This lawyer did not work for Liz Renay. This lawyer worked for Mickey Cohen. The attorney's job was clear and impossible. Defend Liz Renay against perjury charges without ever implicating Mickey Cohen. You cannot explain massive sums of dirty money without explaining the source. The defense strategy was forced to double down on the lies. They planned to walk into a federal courtroom and argue that a struggling actress had legitimately acquired hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash. They planned to insult the intelligence of a trial jury to protect a mobster. When the trial commenced in downtown Los Angeles, the media frenzy returned with a vengeance. Smelling blood, newspapers ran daily front-page updates dubbing her the syndicate siren. They focused obsessively on her tight dresses and measurements. treating the trial like a scandalous movie premiere while completely ignoring the terrifying reality of a woman being ground up by both a criminal syndicate and the federal government. She sat at the defense table. She looked pale. The tailored suits could not hide the fact that she was shrinking under the pressure. The prosecution methodically and mercilessly destroyed her defense. It was a master class in forensic accounting. They did not yell. They just presented the paper. They called bank tellers to the stand. The tellers pointed at Liz. They testified that she routinely walked into the bank carrying brown paper bags stuffed with uncounted cash. They called tax experts. The experts presented charts proving she had absolutely no legitimate source of income to match the deposits. The evidence was overwhelming. It was a mountain of financial data pointing directly at her guilt. Her defense attorney, constrained by Mickey's orders, put up a pathetic fight. He called her to the stand. It was a desperate, suicidal legal move. She had to convince 12 ordinary citizens that she was a wealthy, independent businesswoman, not a mobster's pawn. Taking the stand, she repeated the rehearsed lies, desperately trying to deploy her charm and play the role of the naive beauty for the jury. The performance failed spectacularly. The jury saw right through the performance. They did not see a glamorous starlet. They saw a frightened, manipulated woman reciting lines written by a criminal. The federal prosecutor stepped up for cross-examination. He was relentless. He backed her into logical corners. He caught her in contradictions. He forced her to admit she had lied about small details regarding dates and times. In a courtroom, once a witness lies about small details, the jury assumes they are lying about everything. Her credibility was completely shredded in front of the world. She stepped down from the witness stand knowing she had lost. The illusion was shattered. She was completely exposed. The closing arguments were delivered. The jury retired to deliberate. They did not take long. The evidence was too clear. The lies were too obvious. A woman with no job cannot deposit hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash without committing a crime. The bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. They filed back into the courtroom. The air was thick and heavy. Liz stood up, her knees locked to keep from collapsing. She gripped the edge of the heavy oak defense table so hard her hands cramped. The judge asked the foreman for the verdict. The foreman stood up. He held a small slip of paper. He read the word clearly into the microphone. Guilty. The word slammed into her chest like a physical blow. It knocked the air completely out of her lungs. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for the exit to call in the headline. The prosecutor quietly packed his briefcase, another victory secured. Liz looked around the room. She turned around and looked at the back row of the gallery. She looked for a familiar face. She looked for the man who had promised her the world, the man who had orchestrated this entire nightmare. She looked for Mickey Cohen. The row was empty. He was not there. He was miles away, safe in his Brentwood fortress, entirely insulated from the fallout. The scapegoat had absorbed the bullet, and the man pulling the strings had simply walked away. She stood there, convicted of a federal felony, entirely and utterly alone. The guilty verdict echoed in the silent courtroom. It was a single word, but it dismantled a human life completely. Liz Renay stood at the defense table. She did not faint. She did not scream. The shock was too absolute for theatrics. She was a woman who had spent years memorizing scripts, and now she had run out of lines. The federal prosecutor packed his briefcase. The jury filed out of the room. They returned to their homes and their families. Liz was directed to sit back down. She was now a convicted felon waiting for a sentence. The weeks between the verdict and the sentencing hearing were a descent into a specific kind of psychological hell. She was allowed to remain free on bail, But freedom was an illusion. Mickey Cohen still paid the bondsman. He still controlled her movements, but the nature of his control had shifted. He no longer needed to charm her. He no longer needed to pretend. The fall girl had successfully absorbed the legal bullet. He discarded the act. He did not call her. He did not invite her to Brentwood. She was entirely cut off from the only world she had known. She sat in the luxury apartment he paid for, surrounded by the expensive clothes he bought her, and waited for the phone to ring. It remained silent. The silence was a weapon. It confirmed her absolute lack of value to the organization. She was a defective tool. You do not comfort a defective tool. You throw it in the garbage. She spent those weeks pacing the floor. She drank heavily. She tried to numb the terror of the impending prison sentence. She stared at the telephone. The trauma bond was a resilient parasite. Even after he abandoned her in the courtroom, a sick, conditioned part of her brain still hoped he would save her. She hoped he would use his underworld connections to bribe a judge or threaten a witness. She clung to the very corruption that had destroyed her. It is the tragic hallmark of coercive control. The victim looks to the executioner for a pardon. The day of the sentencing arrived. She returned to the federal courthouse. The press was waiting, hungrier than before. They wanted the final act of the tragedy. They wanted to see the glamorous mob mall break down in tears. She walked past them head down, shielded by lawyers she did not trust. She stood before the federal judge. The courtroom was packed. The air was thick and stale. The judge looked down at her from the high bench. He did not see a manipulated victim. He did not care about the psychological tactics used by Mickey Cohen. The justice system is a blunt instrument. It evaluates actions, not coercion. It saw a woman who had willingly signed fraudulent bank documents and lied under oath to protect a major syndicate figure. Her lawyer made a pathetic plea for leniency. He cited her lack of prior criminal history. He spoke about her aspirations. It was hollow rhetoric. The federal prosecutor stood up and demanded a harsh penalty. He argued that a lenient sentence would encourage other associates to lie for mob bosses. He argued that she was a willing participant in a criminal enterprise. He needed to make an example of her. He needed to show the Los Angeles underworld that the federal government would crush anyone who stood in its way. The judge agreed. He looked directly at Liz. He delivered a stern lecture on the sanctity of the truth. He spoke about the corrosive nature of organized crime. Then he delivered the sentence: 3 years in federal prison, 36 months. The gavel struck the sound block. The sharp crack finalized the destruction of her Hollywood dream. The sound severed her connection to the free world. The judge ordered her to be taken into custody immediately. There would be no time to go home and pack. There would be no time to say goodbye. The transition was instantaneous and brutal. The federal marshals moved in. Her glamorous facade was dismantled in a cold courthouse holding cell. She was searched, handed prison drab, and shackled. The pearl necklace Mickey had bought her was left unclasped on the concrete floor. She was loaded onto a transport bus headed for Terminal Island in the Los Angeles harbor. As the heavy steel gates closed behind the bus, her previous life ceased to exist. The intake process was relentless. The federal penal system doesn't recognize individuality. It recognizes numbers. Her name was entirely erased. Carrying a thin bedroll, she was marched down a deafening, echoing corridor of confined humanity and shoved into a tiny cinder block cell. The heavy barred door slid shut. The lock engaged. Liz stood in the center of the cell. She looked at the cinder block walls. She looked at the metal toilet. She dropped her bedroll onto the thin mattress. The physical reality of her situation finally caught up with her psychological trauma. The adrenaline completely evaporated. Her legs gave out. She sat on the edge of the metal bed. This was the end of the road. This was the final destination of the glamorous journey she had embarked upon. She had traded a life of quiet poverty for a life of terrifying luxury, and she had ended up in a concrete box. She thought about the man who had put her here. She thought about Mickey Cohen sitting in his Brentwood mansion. He was likely smoking a cigar and counting cash. He was completely untouched by her suffering. The cognitive dissonance completely shattered. The psychological conditioning snapped under the crushing weight of the federal prison system. He was not a protector. He was a parasite. He had identified her ambition and weaponized it against her. He had fed her vanity to secure her loyalty. He had bought her clothes and jewelry not because he valued her, but because he needed to decorate his sacrificial lamb. When the bullets started flying, he simply stepped behind her. She looked at her hands. They were trembling. The manicured nails were already chipped. She traced the rough fabric of the prison uniform. She realized the profound depth of his manipulation. He had not just stolen her freedom. He had stolen her mind. He had convinced her that destroying herself was an act of loyalty. He had convinced her that perjury was a normal marital duty. The brainwashing was so complete, so absolute, that she had walked into a federal courtroom and lied to a judge without hesitation. She had been the perfect, compliant pawn. Night fell over Terminal Island. The harsh fluorescent lights in the cell block were turned off, replaced by dim security lighting. The chaotic noise of the day settled into a low, restless hum of coughs, whispers, and the rattling of chains. Liz lay on the thin mattress. The blanket offered no warmth against the chill of the concrete. She stared at the ceiling. She was entirely alone. There were no cameras. There were no reporters. There was no mob boss whispering in her ear. She cried. It was not a performative cry for sympathy. It was a raw, silent, gut-wrenching purge of grief. She mourned the death of her career. She mourned the loss of her freedom. But mostly she mourned the girl she used to be. She mourned Pearl Dobbins, the girl who had believed in Hollywood magic, only to be devoured by a monster wearing a tailored suit. The tears eventually stopped. The grief settled into a hard, cold knot in her stomach. The illusion was dead. The glamorous Mafia myth was incinerated. She was at the absolute bottom. There was no one left to manipulate her. There was no one left to protect her. She had nothing left to lose. In the darkness of the cell, a new instinct began to take shape. It was not ambition. It was not vanity. It was pure, unadulterated survival. She realized she had to rebuild her mind from the foundation up. She had to purge the programming Mickey Cohen had instilled in her. She had to survive the next 36 months, and she had to do it alone. The Mafia's expendable asset had absorbed the impact. Now the woman left in the wreckage had to figure out how to stand back up. Breaking Cohen's mental grip was far more agonizing than surviving the physical cage. The detox from his coercive control tore her apart, hitting her system harder than a heavy narcotic withdrawal. The morning horn at Terminal Island did not wake Liz Renay. She was already awake. She had not slept. She had spent the entire night staring at the underside of the metal bunk above her. The fluorescent lights flickered to life in the corridor. The harsh glare spilled through the steel bars of her cell. The shadows vanished. The reality of her new existence was fully illuminated. The concrete floor was cold. The air tasted of rust and stale breath. She swung her legs over the side of the thin mattress. Her feet hit the cold floor. Pearl Dobbins stood up. She was an inmate now. The transition was complete. The cell block erupted into a mechanical symphony of institutional control. Heavy doors slammed, keys rattled, guards shouted orders. The women stepped out of their cells and formed single-file lines. Liz joined them. She looked at the women around her. They were not Hollywood extras. They were not wearing makeup. Their faces were hardened by poverty, addiction, and violence. They wore the same shapeless drab dresses. They wore the same heavy shoes. The prison system was a great equalizer. It stripped away the mink coats and the diamond necklaces. It reduced everyone to a uniform level of degradation. They marched to the chow hall. The noise was a physical weight. The smell was a mixture of boiled cabbage and industrial disinfectant. Liz took a metal tray. A worker slammed a scoop of gray oatmeal onto the tin surface. Sitting at a long metal table, she stared at the food as her stomach recoiled. Haunted by memories of champagne and prime rib at Kiro's, she pushed the tray away. A seasoned inmate sitting across from her laughed. The woman told Liz she would eat it tomorrow. Hunger always wins. The woman was right. By the third day, Liz ate the oatmeal. She scraped the tin tray clean. The pride of a Hollywood starlet dissolves quickly when the body demands fuel. She experienced phantom expectations. She would hear a heavy footstep in the corridor, and her heart would leap. A sick, conditioned part of her brain expected Mickey to walk around the corner. She expected him to hand the guards a stack of cash and walk her out the front gates. She expected the magical, corrupt power of the Los Angeles underworld to penetrate the walls of the federal penitentiary. It never happened. The footsteps always belonged to a guard. The doors remained locked. The fantasy withered and died in the damp air of the cell block. The silence from the outside world was absolute. It was a tactical silence. The Hollywood elite who had attended Mickey's parties wiped her from their memories. The studio executives who had promised her screen tests suddenly developed amnesia. The mob associates who had kissed her cheek and called her a sister vanished into the shadows. She was a convicted perjurer. She was radioactive, associating with her invited federal scrutiny. The criminal syndicate operated on the principle of self-preservation. Liz Renay was a severed limb. They tied off the vein and left her to rot. Mastering the harsh mechanics of prison survival, Liz repurposed the observational skills honed at the tables of violent men. Watching the other inmates, she quickly identified the predators and the prey. She learned that survival meant keeping her head down, avoiding eye contact, and realizing that speaking out of turn invited violence. While her California ambition once demanded attention, prison demanded invisibility. Suppressing her deepest instincts to become a ghost, she scrubbed cell block toilets and folded rough sheets in the laundry. Letting the hot steam and bleach burn her hands, she welcomed the physical exhaustion. It was a gift that allowed her to sleep without dreaming. While Liz was scrubbing concrete floors, the illusion of Mickey Cohen's invincibility shattered. Her sacrifice had been entirely futile. The feds followed the paper trail she left behind and indicted him for tax evasion anyway. He was sentenced to 15 years and shipped to Alcatraz. The irony was suffocating. The mob boss and his decoy were both locked on an island surrounded by cold water. However, Liz would not learn of his ultimate physical downfall until after her release. Inside the prison, she just felt the cold, hollow emptiness of knowing she had thrown her life onto a grenade to save a man who was already standing on a landmine. The months dragged on. Summer turned to winter and back to summer. The seasons meant nothing inside the concrete walls. She measured time in the fading of her own memories. The bright lights of Hollywood felt like a hallucination. The memory of the flashbulbs was replaced by the reality of the searchlights sweeping across the prison yard at night. She served 27 months of her 36-month sentence. As her release date approached, a new kind of terror began to take hold. She was institutionalized. The prison had broken her down, but it had also provided a rigid structure. She knew when to eat. She knew where to sleep. The rules were violent, but they were clear. The outside world was no longer a landscape of opportunity. It was a minefield. She was going to be released as a convicted felon. She was a woman approaching middle age in an industry that discarded women at 30. She had no money. Her assets had been seized or squandered to pay legal bills. The luxury apartment was gone. The convertible was gone. The mink coats had likely been sold to a pawn shop by one of Mickey's associates the day she was convicted. She was walking out with less than she had when she arrived in California as Pearl Dobbins. Sitting on the edge of her metal bunk on her final night, she couldn't sleep. Listening to the breathing of the other inmates, she felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the concrete walls one last time. She had survived the physical confinement, the harsh food, the back-breaking labor, and the constant threat of violence. But the true test was waiting on the other side of the gate. She had to re-enter a society that had watched her spectacular downfall and judged her without mercy. She had to face the reporters who had mocked her. She had to navigate a city where every street corner held a memory of her manipulation. The psychological armor she had forged in the heat of the prison laundry room was about to be tested against the cold reality of a ruined reputation. She had taken the bullet for the Mafia. The bullet had passed through her and shattered her life into 1,000 pieces. Tomorrow the gates would open. She would have to walk out onto the asphalt, kneel down in the dirt, and start picking up the shards. The heavy steel gates of Terminal Island rolled open. The mechanical grinding echoed across the harbor. Liz Renay stepped through the gap. She wore a cheap dress. She carried a small cardboard box containing everything she owned. There were no flashbulbs. There were no reporters shouting her name. There was no armored Cadillac waiting at the curb. The silence of the outside world was louder than the chaotic roar of the cell block. She was 35 years old. She was a convicted federal felon. She was entirely free. Taking a deep breath of the salty Pacific air, she found it tasted not of bleach or institutional food, but of survival. Walking toward the bus stop without looking back at the concrete fortress, she knew her debts were settled. She had paid society, which had watched her manipulation with hungry fascination, and she had fully paid the criminal underworld. The ledger was clear. Mickey Cohen had extracted 27 months of her life to buy his own temporary delay. The transaction was over. She owed the mob absolutely nothing. The bus ride back into Los Angeles was a journey into a graveyard. She looked out the window at the palm trees and the neon signs. The city looked exactly the same. The illusion of Hollywood was still operating at full capacity. New girls were arriving on buses every single day. They carried the same ambition she had carried. They possessed the same blind spots. They were walking straight into the same traps. She wanted to scream out the window and warn them. She wanted to tell them the diamonds were rented and the furs were paid for in blood. Renting a cheap room, she set out to find work. She returned to the movie studios, knocking on the doors of casting directors, only to have them repeatedly slammed in her face. The men who used to drink Mickey Cohen's whiskey now pretended they did not know her. They looked at her with thinly veiled disgust. Hollywood deals in fantasy. A woman with a federal prison record destroys the fantasy. They wanted pristine starlets. They did not want a woman who carried the stench of a perjury conviction. The industry blacklisted her completely. She faced a brutal crossroads. She could change her name back to Pearl Dobbins. She could leave California. She could move to a quiet town in the Midwest, get a job as a waitress, and hide her past forever. Many women broken by the syndicate chose that path. They faded into anonymous poverty. Liz refused. She had survived the coercive control of a ruthless killer. She had survived the grinding machinery of the federal justice system. She was not going to let a group of cowardly studio executives dictate her fate. She possessed a singular, undeniable asset. She had infamy. She had a story. If the mainstream studios did not want her, she would go to the margins. She turned to the burlesque stages. She used her notoriety to sell tickets. The marquee signs did not advertise a great actress. They advertised the mob mall. They advertised the woman who went to prison for Mickey Cohen. The crowds lined up. They came out of morbid curiosity. They wanted to see the wreckage. They wanted to see the notorious mob mall in the flesh. She gave them exactly what they paid for, standing on stage to own her past and stripping away the shame right along with the costumes. Refusing to play the victim, she acted like a survivor, monetizing the trauma Mickey had inflicted upon her. By taking control of the transaction, she transformed from a pawn, moving dirty money into an independent woman, earning her own keep. Every dollar she made on that stage was a dollar of pure autonomy. But she didn't stop at the stage. She decided to reclaim her narrative entirely. While newspapers peddled a sensationalized fiction and federal prosecutors pushed a clinical legal account, Liz sat down and wrote the undeniable truth. Her autobiography, appropriately titled My Face for the World to See. The book was a grenade thrown directly at the myth of the glamorous underworld. She did not romanticize the violence. She did not paint Mickey Cohen as a tragic anti-hero. She exposed the brutal, ugly mechanics of his control, the terrifying isolation, and the crushing weight of perjury. She dismantled the illusion piece by piece. The book resonated, striking a nerve with a public finally beginning to understand the dark reality behind the mid-century Hollywood facade. She had stolen her voice back from the men who demanded her silence. The 1970s arrived. The pristine, studio-controlled culture of Los Angeles was fracturing. A new, rebellious underground cinema movement was taking root. A young, provocative filmmaker named John Waters read her book. He was captivated by her absolute authenticity. He did not see a disgraced actress. He saw a woman who had walked through hell and emerged with a fierce, unapologetic energy. Casting her in his chaotic, raw, and filthy underground masterpiece, Desperate Living, Waters didn't want a beautiful victim. Instead, Liz played a wealthy, tyrannical woman thrown into a garbage-filled shanty town. Embracing the madness of the role, she demanded no flattering lighting, allowing her age and scars to show on screen as she delivered a performance of unhinged brilliance. The film became a massive cult classic. Liz Renay achieved the cinematic immortality she had chased since she was a girl, but she did not achieve it by standing quietly next to a powerful man. She achieved it by standing on her own 2 feet in the middle of cinematic chaos. She became an icon to outsiders, outcasts, and survivors. She won the game, but she won it on a board she designed herself. The contrast with her former captor was absolute. In 1963, Mickey Cohen suffered a brutal attack with a lead pipe at Alcatraz. He never recovered. The terrifying boss of the Sunset Strip lived his final years in a wheelchair. He was partially paralyzed and relied on charity. He died in obscurity in 1976. Liz Renay, however, lived for another 3 decades. She refused to let one disastrous chapter dictate her existence. She painted, wrote, and lived loudly. She passed away in 2007 at the age of 80. Some historians still debate her legacy. Was she a tragic victim of manipulation or a casualty of her own blind ambition? Regardless, she outlived her captor and the system that shunned her. She transformed a devastating prison sentence into the foundation of a fiercely independent life.